Hi, everybody. Been a little while. Everybody's hair is a little bit longer, but mine came together today a little bit better than I expected it to. So, uh, glad to be talking to you guys again. Now, we finished up our study on the 1950s, kind of with the Cuban Missile Crisis, really 1962. So, we're past the 50s. We're going to stay in that same time period where we're going to be talking mostly about stuff that happened in the 1950s and 60s with the civil rights movement. And this is a very important, probably our most important unit that we've got. I'm very disappointed that this is the one, it's getting shortchanged because of our remote learning here. So I'm going to put a lot of, in addition to the stuff I'm going to give you to work, I'm going to give you a lot of extra resources, things to watch, stuff like that, that I would encourage you to take a look at because we're talking about the fight for people's equal rights, the fight for people's civil rights, the fight to make this country the place that we've always said that it is. And for a lot of Americans, it really hasn't come through on that promise. And you'll see that we've come a long way in a lot of ways, but there's still an awful long way to go. And events of the last few years have borne that out to a degree that I really didn't really think that it would, but it has. So while we've come a long way, there is still a long way to go in making sure that America is a place of equality, the way we've always said from its very beginning that it is. But like I said before, it really hasn't been that way for entirely too many Americans. So let's take a look. Our first packet here is called The Civil Rights Movement, The Fight for Equality. And if you could, please follow along while I read. The Civil Rights Movement, The Fight for Equality, the beginnings of the Civil Rights Movement. Slavery was ended by the enactment of the 13th Amendment in 1865. The 14th and 15th Amendments soon followed, which guaranteed civil and voting rights to the newly freed African Americans. Unfortunately, in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, those rights steadily eroded as many states enacted racist laws that got around the amendments. In 1896, the court case of Plessy versus Ferguson legalized segregation with its infamous separate but equal doctrine, and segregation became the law of the land in the southern states. Even in states without official segregation, there was often de facto segregation, which meant it was not the law, but it might as well have been. And that those of us in Illinois, it's basically what it was like here. After decades of little progress, the struggle for equality and civil rights picked up strength after World War II. While there was no official segregation in the North, African Americans often faced prejudice in hiring and housing, restricting their opportunities to improve their lives. In the South, the segregation was a way of life. In that part of the country, segregation laws were known as Jim Crow laws. They were reinforced by the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling back in 1896 and formed the bedrock of the entire system of inequality. And there you see that famous photo of the two separate drinking fountains in the South, one for white people, one for black people, and just how you can see they're definitely separate, but they're not equal. It was always a lie, and it never was at any point true. The NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization in America, was founded in the early 20th century, a time known as the Progressive Era. In 1938, a lawyer and activist named Thurgood Marshall became head of the NAACP's legal section. He began laying the legal groundwork for an attack on segregation based on its violation of the 14th Amendment. Sensing the changing times, Brooklyn Dodgers general manager Branch Rickey chose to integrate Major League Baseball when he signed Jackie Robinson to break the color line in 1947. President Harry Truman followed suit in 1948 when he integrated the U.S. Army. And there you see 3 pictures. You got the one here on the left of Jackie Robinson, first black ball player in the major leagues. There he is signing his contract with Branch Rickey, the general manager of the Dodgers. And there on the right is a guy named Larry Doby, who was the first African-American player in the American League. And debuted just a couple of months later, dealt with all of the same exact struggles, the abuse, the threats, all that kind of stuff. And he's not really talked about the same way that Jackie Robinson is, but he dealt with all the same stuff. So yeah, it's important to remember him too. In the early 1950s, Thurgood Marshall believed the time was right to challenge public school segregation. He represented the family of a little girl named Linda Brown in her fight to attend school closer to her home. Marshall challenged the separate but equal doctrine on the basis that segregation made equal education impossible. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled public education integrated, though it took decades to fully integrate schools around the country. And there you see a picture of Thurgood Marshall, as well as a woman with her daughter on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. Many white Southerners were hostile to the process of integration. To them, it was outsiders trying to force them to change their way of life. The fact that the way of life marginalized an entire group of American citizens rarely entered their minds. African Americans, especially in the South, had no political, social, or economic power. Since they had no real way to voice their grievances, it was assumed by many whites that African Americans were content with their status in American society, which could not be further from the truth. The biggest battle over school integration took place in Little Rock, Arkansas. Seeing the result of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, the Little Rock School Board approved a plan of gradual desegregation. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, responding to the anger by whites, refused to implement the plan. He called out the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the 9 African American students from attending Little Rock Central High School. President Eisenhower stepped in, sending the U.S. Army to protect the students as they entered the school. And there you see a couple of photos, here of Elizabeth Eckford going to school on her way to Little Rock Central. Of course, you have the, really awful sight of people heckling her, but at the same time, there were some people who did help her to get into the building without getting hurt. But yeah, it was not a pretty scene. And here you got 6-year-old Ruby Bridges headed to her first day of school in New Orleans, Louisiana, escorted by U.S. Marshals. That was the only way that they felt she could get there safely. In 1955, the focus of desegregation shifted to the state of Alabama. An African-American secretary named Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white rider. In response to her arrest, her church and the local NAACP organized a boycott of Montgomery public bus lines. At the time, African Americans made up about 70% of the city's bus riders. Collectively, the Montgomery African American population had economic power they did not possess individually. By sticking to the boycott and refusing to ride segregated buses for 381 days, they forced the bus lines to desegregate to protect their businesses. Also coming to national prominence during the boycott was a little-known African-American minister and activist in Montgomery named Martin Luther King Jr. He led the boycott and acted as its spokesman. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was illegal. On December 21st, King boarded a desegregated bus in Montgomery for the first time. An expanding role for government. In 1953, Earl Warren became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was expected to keep the court on a conservative track, but the Warren Court went on to become one of the most liberal and progressive courts in American history. Warren believed the Constitution must be interpreted flexibly. The Warren Court made decisions in the realm of civil rights, such as its desegregation rulings in the 1950s. It also ruled in Miranda versus Arizona that in 1966 that police now have to advise arrested persons of their right to remain silent and have legal counsel present. In Tinker versus Des Moines School District 1969, the court ruled the free speech of students was violated when they were suspended for wearing black armbands to protest the war in Vietnam. These decisions have a far-reaching effect on American life today. In 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. He became convinced of the need for extensive civil rights legislation as well as anti-poverty programs. Unfortunately, he did not live to see his program, The New Frontier, come to fruition. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. Kennedy's accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself murdered on live TV 2 days later as he was being transferred from the Dallas Municipal Jail to the more secure county jail. And there you see a picture on the left of President Kennedy and his wife Jackie just minutes before he was murdered. And there was the accused assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. And this is the moment he was shot 2 days later, which was on live TV. The whole world saw it happen in the basement of the Dallas police station. And whatever secrets he had about the assassination went to Oswald's grave. Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, became the new president. Johnson started his career as an educator in a school teaching Mexican-American students to whom he developed a deep attachment and got involved in politics as a supporter of President Roosevelt's New Deal during the Depression. Johnson pushed through much of Kennedy's legislation, including a major civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There you see President Johnson. Eventually, Johnson termed his own program of civil rights and anti-poverty legislation the Great Society. While much of the Great Society went unfulfilled as the war in Vietnam tore American society apart in the late 1960s, some programs are still with us. Head Start, a program that provides preschool to needy children, is active in Plano and many communities in America. A nationwide health insurance program called Medicare helps citizens 65 or older pay for their medical bills and remains very popular. Critics argued that providing for people's needs on such a scale was not a proper function of the federal government. Supporters argue that much like in the Great Depression, private organizations and charities are nowhere near enough to combat poverty on a national level. The debate over the proper role of government provided assistance that continues even today. So you see kind of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, a lot of stuff that happened in the late 1940s and 1950s, even going into the 1960s with President Johnson's Great Society Anti-Poverty Program. And that really was well-meaning but came off the rails because we got more and more involved in a war where something that didn't have anything to do with civil rights and poverty and all that kind of stuff kind of took the nation's attention away from that struggle, and unfortunately, because of that, whatever good the Great Society could have brought about, a lot of it remained unrealized. So we'll pick it up there in our next packet. You'll get to work on the FBI notes, and I will see you then. Okay.